And I'm pleased to have His Excellency Secretary General Changong and Dr. Harmgaard with us today. Both panelists are experts in the international domain, and they have huge experience in legislation and development finance. I'm excited to kick off this discussion, and my question will go to both of you. Perhaps we'll start with you, Secretary General. In today's fragmented world, marred by conflict, natural disasters, climate challenges, vague economic outlook, and a world that just emerged from a pandemic, a once-in-a-life pandemic, why is it important for governments to be part of the multilateral system and multilateral bodies? And the same goes for parliaments.
Thank you very much, distinguished moderator. It gives me pleasure to be here with you. Let me not be politically correct in saying that you did refer to challenges faced by governments. No, there are challenges faced by the global community, challenges faced by people, because we tend to look at governance and governments in terms of states, whereas we are not looking at them in terms of the people who are behind the states and government. So for me, it is challenges facing the global community. The second point is, you mentioned these challenges, all the challenges that you mentioned are global in scope. No single one of them has a national passport. When you're talking about climate change, what is happening in the UAE has an effect in what is happening in other parts of Asia and part of the world. The pandemic, when it came, it did not single out any country and say, no, I'm not going to go to that country. It went, COVID. So we are talking of something or challenges that require us to look at the globality of the solutions that we have to provide to rise to these challenges. So for me, I think that multilateralism is the way to go. Multilateralism that brings together everybody, is inclusive, and makes sure that, quote unquote, no one is left behind. Because the problems that we face in the solutions that we propose are very exclusive. You know, people, when the pandemic came, what happened? People pulled the blanket over themselves to try to protect their own selves and didn't care about the rest of the world. So now, what is very good with this summit, this summit of, what they call it, World Governments Summit, is that it is federating a wide range of stakeholders. Executive arms of government, they're here, the heads of state and prime ministers and ministers are here. You have the legislative arm of government. I represent parliaments, the formal part of the state architecture. You have the private sector, civil society, everybody's here. So at the end of the day, the outcomes of this meeting will be owned by everyone. It will not be something that is for the governments to decide or to implement. We'll all have a stake. That's why I think it is very important to have this multilateral approach. I'm not saying that multilateralism has helped us solve all the global problems. Far from it. In fact, it has been found wanting because the practices and the institutions that have been created to mobilize, to promote multilateralism have not been equal to the task. That's why today we are talking of a reformed multilateralism. We are not saying you throw the baby out with the bathwater. You're saying that you're using this opportunity to redesign multilateralism, not the multilateralism of 1945 when the UN was created, but the multilateralism of the 21st century. And so I would want to plead for continuing multilateralism. And when we talk of multilateralism, I don't know, Mr. Chair, Moderator, how many minutes I've got. But we always talk in terms of intergovernmental multilateralism, as happens at the United Nations. No, it is, you have other forms of multilateralism at the parliamentary level. I represent that constituency. We talk of parliamentary diplomacy which can complement traditional diplomacy as practiced in the UN. And we have, I think we'll have time to go into examples of how parliamentary diplomacy is rolled out. But I think I should stop here and let my fellow panelists to also have the opportunity to say something.
Thank you, Secretary General. Very insightful, and I stand corrected. It is definitely challenges facing the entire globe, not just governments. So thank you, Dr. Harmgard.
Thank you. And I think maybe just following on to this, exactly that both the challenges actually don't have a passport and are global in nature, but I also want to say also the solutions are global in nature and are not, so there's not necessarily one person, one country, one government, one company that has the solution that fits the specific circumstance. So I think I also want to think of the solution space, which is global, and if we don't utilize sort of this interconnectivity, we will actually, miss out on the potential of finding the right solutions. Yes, ultimately the solutions will be local. They will not be somewhere in space, but they will be local. But I think, we really need to make sure that we get all of the expertise into one room. And maybe just to give one example, because of course this is also one of the summits that has talked a lot about AI, and we've just been talking a bit about AI and how kids are interfacing with AI at the moment. And I think, digitalization, it's a journey, but I think the UAE, of course, is one of the leading proponents of digitalization, AI, but I want to just give you an example from my experience at the EBRD. So we're working with Tunisia, and Tunisia actually doesn't have a lot of digital interface between the different parts of the government and the people or the businesses. And so another country where we work in, Estonia. Estonia is sort of like the UAE, but in Northern Europe where it's really cold. And they are one of the most digitalized countries on the planet. And so we got Estonian company and Estonian government officials to Tunisia to help design digital solutions for e-government, so basically the individual interfacing with the government, but also for companies to reduce the time companies have to wait to get a legislation, to get registered, to get a permit. And I think so we're missing out on these partnerships and these solutions if we don't look at multilateralism in the broadest sense of the word and in today's sense, not in 1945.
Yeah,
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Harmgard. Secretary General, back to you. You are the first African to lead the IPU in its 125-year-old existence. What does that mean for the beautiful continent of Africa? And why is it important for Africa in terms of inclusion, in terms of representation, in terms of legislation and policies? Different regions are in different stages of development, and one size does not fit all.
Yeah, thank you very much. It is an honor to be indeed the first African to lead the organization. It's 135 years old today. I did say to you that it's at once an honor, but a big challenge, because the IPU, the Interparliamentary Union, has known secretaries general coming from a certain part of the world, and they've come to expect certain standards. You now have to raise that bar very high, being the first what you call unidentified flying object in the IPU. And so we have to do more. You go to bed thinking, what am I going to do that is different from what my predecessors did? And that is what has spurred me. And one thing that I have been very insistent on is inclusion. I did campaign on that we need to be inclusive. Our governance has to be inclusive of all. It used to be that when you came to these big gatherings like this one, the leadership of this world would focus on the big issues that concern the United States, Russia, and all of that. Not anymore. I think that when you're talking about climate change here, you hear the voice of the big guys, but also you hear the voice of the smaller guys, the small island developing states that are threatened in their very existence. So I think that it is something that we have tried to do in the IPU, to give voice to every constituent. I have also been very robust in promoting the gender equality agenda. It is important that our processes be seen to be representative, and they cannot be representative if you just have one segment of society being represented in the institutions of governance. So over the years, we have seen an exponential increase in the number of women holding leadership positions within the organization itself, within parliaments, and generally at large. And I can say that it is something that we promote. But when you go back to Africa, as you asked, I think that what is happening in Africa today, in certain parts of Africa, West Africa in particular, is worrisome because we see that there is an apparent rollback of progress along the path to democracy. But I am also very sanguine, and I say if you have 6 countries in Africa experiencing coups out of 54, maybe that's not a bad thing, or it is a bad thing in one way, but it is not catastrophic. We need to work with those 6 to make sure that they come back into the fold. And so it gives me more responsibility. In the past several weeks, I've been traveling to many of these trouble spots in Africa to see how we can engage the military authorities to restore constitutional rule at short notice, because it's important that we move on. You cannot afford to have disruptions in the democracy process, because this is going to affect the developmental process in many countries. So you ask me what makes me tick. I would say, yes, I'm an African, but I'm not giving preferential treatment to Africa. Africa is a continent like any other one. I have just been to the Southern Caucasus to try to see how we can engage the parliaments in Armenia and Azerbaijan to support the ongoing peace efforts in the region. So we have to give equal treatment to all. Maybe in the past it had been that Africa did not receive that attention, but today, in view of my own inclusion agenda, I am making sure that Africa has its own fair share of attention, just like the United States, just like Asia and the Pacific. So that's my long answer to a short question.
Thank you, Secretary General. And you mentioned something very important, which is equal treatment, which leads me to my next question to Dr. Harmgard. Would you say there is a common misconception from the general public about the role of multilateral development banks and international finance institutions, about the role they play in developing nations? If you ask the common folk about the role of these institutions, they will tell you that they push poor countries into a deeper hole and they exacerbate the situation. So what is the public missing about the role of these institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the EBRD, in terms of setting policies, governance, lending, surveillance, and so on?
I think we need to be better in communicating what we actually do to the beneficiaries on the ground. And maybe I want to speak a little bit about the EBRD, because I don't want to presume that I know everything about the World Bank or the IMF and their legacy. But I think, so as EBRD, we've been founded after the fall of the Berlin Wall to really help the private sector, first in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and moved after the Arab Spring to North Africa and the Middle East. And I think the aim was always to help the private sector. But I think, so the key is really to see what ultimately the loans are used for. So what are the private sector companies building? How many people are they employing? Where are they, saving electricity or moving to more sustainable resources? How have they become more inclusive and hired more women at their boards? And so I think we need to become better in communicating, not just, we were just discussing, it used to be like, oh, it's always a photo of when you sign a loan agreement with a CEO or even with a government entity. No, we need to take the public to, okay, no, but this is the port expansion that was constructed, and this is the many people that work there, and this is the trade that it facilitates, and this is why this country now can import more, and this is how it gets transported. And so I think it's really explaining how the projects on the ground are changing and improving the lives of every individual in this communities. And also, I think we have become a bit better in consultations. I think that's actually something which is important. When I was sharing an example of a wastewater network that we financed in north of Jordan, which were actually benefiting a lot of Jordanians, but also Syrian refugees. And so it was the first time we actually held all these community sessions with the local community that also included refugees to explain what the network will do, the 160,000 households that would get access, but also who could apply for jobs in the construction sector and who could apply for jobs in the environmental assessment. So I think key becomes that the solution are just really need to be explained on the local level. And I feel also as an institution, we've really moved out of headquarters. So I live in Cairo, I'm responsible for North Africa, and I travel only across North Africa and the Middle East. I mean, sometimes I go to headquarters, I try to avoid it, but I think we've really become much more local, and I think all the teams, for example, the 250 people that work in the different countries, they are, Moroccan, Tunisians, Egyptians, Jordanians, Palestinians, Lebanese, so they are also experts from these countries, so they understand what is actually needed and how to talk to, the population. So I think we as institutions have become better, and I think we also work with the projects that we support to explain them better. But I think we're not there yet, but I hope that some of the misperceptions are addressed, and I think some of the feedback also has been taken on board in terms of being more inclusive and consultative.
May I just chip in there?
Please.
And say I agree with what Hengad is saying, but I would like to also make a case for ongoing consultations between the development banks or external partners of these countries, having those consultations with the legislative authorities of the countries concerned, because parliaments are there to oversee. One of the functions of parliaments is to oversee government, to make sure that government is doing what it is supposed to do in an efficient manner. And we're talking of taxpayers' resources that are being pumped into these countries. Somebody has to be accountable for them, and parliaments can do that for you. But also, parliaments can help create legislative frameworks that are friendly to donor support, that are friendly to development programs in the countries concerned. Looking at issues of investment, tax systems, and all of that, parliaments have the role to create such a legislative environment. So I would like to encourage, from my own experience, we've seen that interaction between external partners such as the development banks and the legislative institutions has helped a lot to create better awareness of the raison d'etre, the rationale of this development bank activities and projects on the ground. So I would make that point for us going forward, especially when we're talking about sustainable development. And we cannot, in the past we would say it's a government thing, it's the executive arm of government, they'll drive the development agenda. Not anymore. We need partners such as the development banks, we need civil society, we need parliament to work together.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's a cohesive conversation.
No, and absolutely, and maybe coming in there is actually that we started these little experiences when we did legislation, for example, on renewable energy. So what is needed for a private-to-private sale of solar energy to a company? And I think we did a trial actually for the first time to go to different energy committees in parliament in Egypt. And it was very interesting because there was a lot of knowledge, but a lot of interest also. And we actually got really good feedback on the legislation that was sort of building from the parliamentary committees in particular. And I think this is actually a dialogue that we definitely need to do more of, but I think in particular on these legislative agendas that have impact for a large part of the population, I think there's a very interesting, feedback loop that we're missing if we don't do it.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's a collective conversation because whatever projects these international institutions implement affects the whole society. So you have to involve, as the Secretary General said, the entire segments of society, whether it's CSO, NGOs, legislation, and executive. I look around the room and I cannot help but notice the number of women in this hall with us today, which brings us to the issue of gender equality and empowering of women. So it's appropriate to go back to you, Dr. Hamburg. And how would you say the EBRD approaches this issue when it comes to engaging with member countries?
I mean, I have to say, I think this is a quote, and I think I'm stealing it from Dr. Rania Al-Mashad, I think. She always says that, involving women in the economy at all levels is macro-critical. And so really that if you don't do it, you're just missing out not just of half of your talent, but you're really missing out on all the interfaces that you could have if you were to properly engage women at all levels of society. So I'm a banker, so I try to engage, of course, women-owned businesses, women-managed businesses. I try to engage also, of course, with governments or state-owned entities to include higher share of women. And I remember it was quite interesting. We financed the National Electricity and Power Company of Jordan to really green and improve the amount of solar energy that they would include. And then we said, look, shall we help you on governance? And they're like, yeah. And then we said, okay, so what are we going to do at women at your board? And they're like, oh yeah, just sort of, we just leave it as it is, whoever's. And we're like, no, I think if we set targets, that would be actually better. And then it was very interesting because then they agreed on a target of a third of the members of the board of this national power company should be women. And I think at the beginning, some people were skeptical. Are we finding all these, strategic electricity experts on renewable energy, on other topics? And then, actually, they found more. It was really interesting that having set the target and having just looked at what kind of expertise they wanted, actually there was a lot more women that wanted to be on this board and contributed to the discussion. So I think we shouldn't be shy to setting targets, and we shouldn't be shy to also, really make sure that countries and governments and different levels don't miss out on this macro-critical element.
Absolutely. Secretary General, you're a father to 2 girls. I'm sure this is an issue that keeps you up at night. How do you factor this in legislations, especially when it comes to women being integrated in the formal labor market, access to finance, especially in poor and vulnerable countries?
Thank you very much. I happen to be very lucky to have 2 very strong girls at home, and they can hold their own in this men's world. So I don't need to worry about them. But I am worried about the vast majority of women out there who are not empowered, who don't feel represented. And when we talk about this, I hate to answer one question when they ask me, so why is it critical to have women represented? What do they bring? And I said, have you ever asked a man what they bring to governance? Why should men be where they are? And so I think that it is only natural for society being made of men and women for those 2 to work hand in hand. And that's what I say. That having been said, we recognize that there is imbalance, and that is in terms of representation, in terms of empowerment, because it's not enough to have women in parliament. It is even more important to empower them to deliver. Otherwise, we make the case for people who say women are not competent, and it's not true. And there are symbolic things that we need to do, like we're sitting in this panel. I am chair of the global board of the International Gender Champions, which is a network of leaders, global leaders, including Mr. Guterres, the President of the General Assembly of the UN. They're all members of this network. We are committed to promoting gender equality. And a symbolic thing like the one here, you see, I am sitting side by side, a very powerful woman. When I'm invited to a panel, one of the questions my executive office asks is, who are the other members of the panel? If I see it's going to be an all-male panel, the instructions are to turn down the invitation. I don't sit. Just to show that we can set the example, we can walk the talk and make sure that women are always at the table as seen to be contributing to this conversation. Today, what do we have? We have women accounting for just over a quarter of the parliamentary seats worldwide. That shouldn't be the case. We should be talking of parity 50-50, and we're working for that. It requires us to have laws that are favorable to women's representation, and this includes legislative quotas, because you have to level the playing field. Today it's not level, and women do not have access to the same level of resources as the men. So how do you do this? Economic empowerment of the women, making sure that they have their own independent source of revenue which they can use. And then what we see now, and it is something that I want to stress here, is that there are some obstacles to women's political emancipation, and that is violence against women, especially violence against women politicians. We've seen this. Our studies show that 76% of women leaders, women parliamentarians, have come in for sexism, sexual harassment, or sexual assault, which is unacceptable in the first place, but also is an obstacle to their political emancipation. So it is something that we need to fight. You need to fight, you have to look at gender equality in terms of representation, empowerment, also in terms of promoting and protecting their human rights, because there is no place under the sun for violence against women, especially women politicians.
Excellent. Thank you both. And in the spirit of gender equality, our last question will first go to Dr. Harmgard, since you already answered 2 questions first. So, and this is a government summit. It has to do with the role of governments in making citizens' life comfortable and easy. What are the global challenges that you see in the horizon that will be facing governments? You interact with a lot of partners and members in the region globally. What would be emerging challenges? Is it climate? Is it AI? Is it inequality? Is it all together?
I think all of these are emerging and current challenges that governments in this part and globally are facing. But I think the biggest challenge is going to be to square long-term gains with short-term costs. And I think, we all see with all the global shocks at the moment, just short-term uncertainty, short-term costs, quick turnover in governments. And I think, but the opportunities, we're missing out on the opportunities which are more medium-term, more long-term, these opportunities of a true transition to a greener economy, of a more equal economy. So I think it's really about still bridging the gap about the short-term challenges and the long-term gains with governments. And I think trying to instill continuity in government policy. And that doesn't mean continuity in government representation. It can be a lot of changes, but I think the challenges that governments face and that the challenges that we face as an investor with governments is that to really make a difference in climate arena and the inclusion arena, we are looking at projects that will bear fruit, in the next 5 years and potentially 10 years, so beyond a government cycle. So I think you need to ensure that there is a bit of long-term vision while dealing with short-term crises.
Secretary General, last words.
I think it's AI. AI is the single most, challenging phenomenon facing the global community today. But I am very positive and optimistic because there is that global sense of awareness. During this summit, it's been artificial intelligence at every nook and corner, which means that we are committed to harnessing artificial intelligence for the common good. That is what I take from this summit, which means that we need to regulate in the good sense, manage artificial intelligence, make sure that we can reap maximum benefit from its opportunities, and that we try to minimize the disruptive and dangerous effects of artificial intelligence, because it has the potential to wreak havoc in society. So I think that it is going to be around with us for a long time, in addition to the continuing existential threat of climate change and, of course, the existence of conflicts around the world. Unfortunately, in the 135 years of the IPU's history, there's always been a conflict somewhere, armed conflict in that manner, and I think it's going to be that way. But what is important is that we are able to come to grips with this conflict and see how we can resolve them in a peaceful manner.
Absolutely. Well, this is all the time we have today. Dr. Harmgard, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Secretary General. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our guests today for a wonderful discussion.